stresses that the refusal of opposition to conduct dialogue hinders any solution for crisis in Syria. The Ministerial Committee discusses executive mechanisms for facilitating the entry of political figures taking part in dialogue. Egyptian organizations for human rights record grave violations during the last 2 years. Good afternoon, this is Irado Krikorian with the news in English. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said the terrorist acts are continuing in Syria because of the uncontrolled flow of weapons and gunmen into the country. In a speech during the annual conference on the results of the Russian diplomacy in 2012, Lavrov stressed that the priority for Russia is to consolidate dialogue in order to solve the crisis in Syria in full accordance with the Geneva Statement without any distortion. He called upon all sides to immediately stop violence and sit at the dialogue table. He added that Russia is meeting with all the sides in Syria, whether from the government or the opposition, and calls upon all external players, including the members of the UN Security Council and Turkey, to implement the Geneva Statement. He said the efforts of Russia and China with the UN envoy to Syria, Lakhdar al-Brahimi, are hindered by the Syrian opposition, which rejects dialogue and insists on bringing down the regime, which is unacceptable and will not be useful for dialogue.
Dialogue is our priority to solve the crisis in Syria. Our foreign policy aims at solving the crises in the world. There is concern over the situation in Syria and the area around it. We hear every day of terrorist acts being perpetrated as weapons continue to be deployed and the flow of arms goes on without any supervision.
Answering a question on the evacuation of Russian citizens from Syria, Lavrov stressed that Moscow is not evacuating its citizens from Syria.
There are tens of thousands of Russian citizens in Syria, and less than 100 families have agreed to travel to Russia. The situation in Syria, according to the evaluation of the Russian embassy, does not require the implementation of the emergency situation plan for the evacuation of Russian citizens.
In the presence of head of the National Security Bureau and the Minister of Interior, as well as several directors at the ministry, the Ministerial Committee assigned the task of implementing the political program to solve the crisis in Syria. As discussed in its meeting under the chairmanship of Prime Minister Wael al-Halaqi, the Interior Ministry's memo and the guarantees that should be presented to the Syrian opposition figures abroad in case they come into Syria to take part in the sessions of dialogue that the committee will be holding preliminary to the convention of a comprehensive national dialogue conference. The members of the Ministerial Committee presented their remarks on the measures and mechanisms that should be taken in this respect at the land, sea and air borders outlets and the relevant logistic arrangements to be made to ensure the convention of such dialogue in an honest, expressive, national, democratic atmosphere according to the best legal standards. The Supreme Relief Committee, headed by the Minister of Social Affairs and Labour, Mr. Jassim Zakaria, has discussed means of securing residences for the inhabitants who have been affected by the crimes of the armed terrorist groups in Syria. The committee stressed that the task of securing shelters requires big efforts in order to fulfill the promises made to the affected, whether inside or outside the country. Head of the Syrian Women Federation, Majid Kwuit, said the federation was ready to secure a center in Al-Qamishli near the Turkish borders in order to harbor returning families. She praised the efforts exerted by the Red Crescent organization and the International Red Cross based on a program that aims at securing residences and the requirements of decent life for the affected. Our armed forces continue to pursue terrorist groups in Homs. An army unit has targeted a terrorist gathering in Tel Dou in Homs suburbs, where gunmen used to perpetrate acts of killing and attacked citizens and properties. The operation resulted in killing and wounding a number of terrorists. The Egyptian Organization for Human Rights stressed that during the last 2 years, very grave violations of human rights occurred in the country. In its annual report about freedom of expression in Egypt, the organization pointed out that during President Morsi's rule, the political, economic and intellectual life witnessed a rapid deterioration. In its report, the organization also acknowledged that women's rights have been greatly undermined with troubling violence against religious minorities. Kuwaiti security forces used tear gas to disperse hundreds of demonstrators who took out to the streets for the third time this month, demanding the dismantling of the new National Council and the abolishing of the election system and protecting individual freedoms. The opposition says that the new parliament is dominated by government allies and supporters, calling for returning to the four-candidate election system. General elections in Jordan kicked off today as the Muslim Brotherhood and several other parties urged voters to boycott it. Some 2.3 million people are eligible to vote in Jordan. However, the calls to ignore the elections sent by the Islamists may negatively affect the turnout. With major parties abstaining from the election process, the majority of some 1,500 candidates are tribal leaders, public figures and businessmen. They are running for 150 seats in the country's 17th parliament amid thorny problems related to corruption and economic hardships. Israeli extremist rightist bloc and the moderate leftist won the same number of seats in the Israeli Knesset after counting 99% of the votes. Netanyahu's Likud and his partners, Avigdor Lieberman's party, won 31 seats out of the 120 seats in Knesset. The other parties affiliated with Likud won 11 seats. The leftists won 19 seats and the Labour clinched 15 seats. News reports pointed out that Qatar supported Netanyahu's election campaign by donating $3 million to Likud party and $2.5 million to Lieberman's party. With this, we conclude our news for today. Thank you for watching. For more news about Syria and the region and to view this bulletin again, you can always visit our website in English, syriaonline.sy. And now over to business and market news with Vani Gunjan after a short break.